There are few women in history whose names have been spoken with as much fascination, confusion, devotion, and controversy as Mary Magdalene. For centuries, people have argued about who she really was: a sinner, a saint, a broken woman, a fearless disciple, a mystery, a myth, a witness. But behind all the speculation, behind the paintings and sermons, behind the legends and the rumors, there is a quieter and far more powerful story. It is the story of a woman who was once shattered and then healed. A woman who stood near the cross when others ran. A woman who came to the tomb while it was still dark. And a woman who became the first voice to announce the greatest message in Christian history. I have seen the Lord. Britannica Vatican. This is the complete story of Mary Magdalene. Before the world turned her into an icon, Mary was simply a woman from Magdala. Magdala was a town on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee, known for fishing and trade. It was a real place, busy and alive, touched by Roman power and Jewish faith, by poverty, hope, and tension. And from this town came a woman whose name would forever be tied, not to a husband, not to a father, but to her place. Mary of Magdala. Mary Magdalene. TIME Smithsonian Magazine. And that detail matters, because in a world where women were often identified by the men around them, Mary is remembered by her own name and her own origin. That alone tells us something. She was not a shadow in somebody else's story. She was part of the story herself. Now the Bible does not tell us much about Mary's early life. It doesn't tell us who her parents were. It doesn't tell us whether she was married, widowed, rich, poor, gentle, or fiery by nature. But it does tell us one unforgettable thing. Jesus had cast 7 demons out of her. Britannica, what exactly does that mean? Across history, people have tried to explain it. Some see it as literal demonic oppression. Others understand it as a sign of severe suffering, spiritual, psychological, or physical torment. But whatever those words meant in her own time, the point is clear. Mary knew what it was to be overwhelmed by darkness. She knew what it felt like to live in pain that other people could not fix. She knew what it meant to be trapped in something larger than herself. She knew despair. And then she met Jesus. We are not told how that meeting happened. Was it in a crowded village? In a home? On a road lined with dust and curious faces? We do not know. But we know what followed. Freedom. Not partial relief, not a temporary comfort. Freedom deep enough that Mary did not simply thank Jesus and go home. She stayed. She followed. She gave her life to the movement that gathered around him. Britannica Smithsonian Magazine. And that is where Mary Magdalene's real story begins. As Jesus traveled through towns and villages, proclaiming the kingdom of God, Mary Magdalene was there. She was not alone. The Gospels mention other women too, Joanna, Susanna, and others, who traveled with Jesus and helped support his ministry. Mary was part of that circle. According to the Gospel accounts, these women even provided for Jesus and his followers out of their own resources. Britannica, think about that for a moment. Mary Magdalene was not just healed by Jesus, she became committed to his mission. She did not remain a passive receiver of mercy. She became an active participant in the work. That changes the way we see her. She was not merely someone with a tragic backstory. She was a disciple, a follower, a supporter, a woman with courage, loyalty, and presence. And yet for generations that truth was buried under a more dramatic label: prostitute. Let's be clear. The Bible never says Mary Magdalene was a prostitute. That idea grew later, especially in Western Christianity, when different women in the gospel stories were blended together. Mary Magdalene, Mary of Bethany, and the unnamed sinful woman who anointed Jesus. In the year 591, Pope Gregory the Great helped cement that interpretation, and for centuries, the image of Mary as a repentant prostitute overshadowed the actual gospel record. Time, Smithsonian Magazine, Vatican. But the real Mary Magdalene does not need that false story to be powerful. Her true story is already extraordinary. She was a woman restored from suffering, a woman who chose devotion, a woman who remained close to Jesus, not because of romance, as later fiction imagined, but because of faith. And as Jesus moved closer to Jerusalem, closer to conflict, closer to the cross, Mary kept following. Now imagine those final days. The city is crowded for Passover. Tension is everywhere. The air feels heavy. The religious authorities are threatened. Rome is always watching. And the man Mary believes changed her life is walking straight into danger. Then comes the arrest. Night, fear, chaos, questions, betrayal. One of the most heartbreaking truths in the gospel story is that many of Jesus' followers scattered in those hours. Fear does that to people. It breaks their courage. It steals their voice. But Mary Magdalene did not disappear. When Jesus was crucified, Mary was there, not in safety, not at a distance in comfort, but near enough to witness the horror. Britannica Smithsonian Magazine. And this is where her love becomes impossible to ignore. It is one thing to follow a teacher when crowds are cheering. It is another to remain when the empire nails him to wood. On that hill of execution, where hope seemed to bleed into the earth, Mary stayed. Maybe she wept quietly. Maybe she could barely stand. Maybe every memory of her healing came crashing back. The day she had first found freedom, the voice that had called her back to life, the mercy that had given her back her own soul. And now that voice was gasping for breath. This is not the sentimental faith of paintings. This is not religion decorated in gold. This is raw grief. Mary Magdalene stood in the place where love cost something. And when Jesus died, she did not turn away from that either. The Gospels remember her as a witness not only of the crucifixion, but also of the burial. She saw where his body was laid. She knew the tomb. She knew the stone. She knew the finality of it. Britannica, that detail would matter very soon. There is something profoundly human about the silence between Good Friday and Easter morning. For us, it is a pause in the story. For them, it was devastation. No one was yet saying, "Sunday is coming," with triumphant confidence. They were not standing inside the ending we know. They were living inside heartbreak. And Mary Magdalene, the woman once delivered from darkness, now faced another darkness, the kind that comes when hope itself seems dead. Maybe that is one reason so many people still feel close to her story. Because Mary is not introduced to us as a perfect person. She is introduced as someone who knew suffering, someone who had already been rescued once. And now, at the tomb, she is about to discover that God's mercy is even bigger than she imagined. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary came to the tomb. That image alone is unforgettable. While it was still dark. Not after sunrise, not when everything made sense, not when the answers were obvious. She came while it was still dark. That is faith, even in confusion. That is love, even in grief. And when she arrived, the stone had been moved. Imagine the shock, the breath leaving her chest, the cold fear. Had the body been taken? Had one final cruelty been committed? In John's Gospel, Mary runs to tell the disciples. Peter and the beloved disciple race to the tomb, see the linen cloths, and leave. But Mary stays. She remains there, outside the tomb, weeping. And that matters too. Others inspect. Mary lingers. Others leave with questions. Mary stays with her sorrow. She stoops to look into the tomb. She sees angels. They ask her why she is weeping. And her answer is heartbreak made simple. Because they have taken away her Lord, and she does not know where they have laid him. Then she turns, and there is Jesus. But at first she does not recognize him. Maybe because tears blur the eyes. Maybe because resurrection is the last thing grief expects. Maybe because sometimes the miracle is standing right in front of us before we can bear to believe it. He asks her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking?" And then comes one of the most beautiful moments in all of Scripture. He says her name, Mary. That is all, just her name. And suddenly the darkness breaks. This is not just a theological event. It is personal, intimate, human. The risen Christ is not only defeating death in the abstract, he is meeting one grieving woman in a garden and calling her by name. Vatican. Can you imagine what that moment felt like? The voice she thought she would never hear again. The one who healed her. The one she watched die. Alive. No wonder history could never forget her. Because before the great speeches, before the spread of churches across the Roman world, before doctrine and councils and cathedrals, there was a woman in a garden hearing her name spoken by the risen Lord. And then Jesus gave her a mission. Go, tell them, tell my brothers, tell the others. And Mary Magdalene went and announced the news. I have seen the Lord. Britannica Vatican. That is why later Christian tradition would give her a remarkable title, Apostle to the Apostles. Not because she was one of the 12, but because she was the first witness of the resurrection, and the first messenger sent to proclaim it to them. Vatican. Let that sink in. The first Easter sermon was carried in the voice of Mary Magdalene. The first human being commissioned to announce the resurrection was not a king, not a priest, not a Roman official, not even one of the famous male disciples. It was Mary. A woman once tormented, a woman once healed, a woman who stayed, a woman who wept, a woman who heard her name, a woman who was trusted with the news that changed the world. And yet strangely, after that triumph, the New Testament grows quiet about her. What happened to Mary Magdalene afterward? The honest answer is, we do not know for certain. Later traditions tried to fill in the silence. Some said she lived in Ephesus. Others said she traveled to southern France. Stories grew around her. Beautiful, dramatic, devotional stories. But history becomes much less certain after the resurrection accounts. What we do know is that she was too important to be forgotten. In some early Christian writings outside the New Testament, most famously the later text known as the Gospel of Mary, Mary appears as a spiritually significant figure, sometimes in tension with Peter. These writings are not part of the canonical Gospels, and they come from a later period, but they show that many early Christians remembered Mary Magdalene as a woman of authority, insight, and remarkable closeness to Jesus. Time Smithsonian Magazine. That memory never fully died, even when other images replaced it. For centuries, artists painted her as a penitent sinner. Preachers turned her into a warning. Popular imagination made her either scandalous or romantic. And in modern fiction, some even reinvented her as Jesus' wife. But neither the prostitute myth nor the marriage fantasy tells us what the earliest sources actually emphasize. The earliest and strongest portrait is simpler, deeper, and far more moving. Mary Magdalene was a faithful disciple of Jesus, a witness to his death, and the first witness to his resurrection. Britannica TIME Smithsonian Magazine. And maybe that is why her story still speaks so powerfully to us now. Because Mary Magdalene is the patron saint of people who have been misjudged, of people whose pain is real but hard to explain, of people whose past has been used to silence them, of people who keep loving even when life turns dark, of people who come to the tomb carrying grief, and discover that grief is not the end. Her story tells us that being broken does not disqualify a person from being chosen, that tears do not cancel faith, that devotion sometimes looks like simply staying when others leave, and that resurrection often begins in the dark before the heart is ready to understand it. So who was Mary Magdalene really? She was not the caricature history often made her. She was not a footnote. She was not a rumor. She was Mary of Magdala, a woman delivered from darkness, a disciple who helped sustain a movement, a witness at the cross, a mourner at the tomb, the first herald of Easter. And maybe the most beautiful thing about her story is this: the world kept trying to rename her. Sinner, temptress, scandal, mystery. But the risen Christ called her by her true name, Mary. And in that one word, everything changed. If you want to remember Mary Magdalene rightly, remember her not as the woman the rumors invented, but as the woman who stood in the garden at dawn, heard her name, and carried hope back to a grieving world.